I'll just give it a minute for people to join in. I'll also share the link on our WhatsApp. We are live on YouTube. I'll give it I'll give it some time for people to join. I'll also share the link on our WhatsApp groups so that people there can start joining in. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. I am Ishan Sharma, and today we are going to discuss a monument that is always in the news for all the good and the bad reasons. And to discuss that, I have a very special guest with me, Tilottama Shome, author of a book meant for children, but I think the grown ups need it more than the children. It's called Taj Mahal, the story of a wonder of the world. Or the publication is Talking Cub, which is, I think, a sister company of Speaking Tigers. And I think this book doesn't need an introduction, but it needs readership because I think this book is the need of the hour, metaphorically and very practically, after seeing what happened yesterday at the Allahabad High Court when a PIL was filed by a couple of people in Lucknow saying that Taj Mahal, the 20 rooms in the Tehkhana of Taj Mahal should be open. They must be surveyed. They might have some Hindu icons in them, but the High Court said that you must get enrolled in an MA program, or just go and research yourself. And if somebody doesn't allow you to do that, then come to us. That was a kind of the attitude of a court towards the PIL. Regardless, I'll introduce the speaker and my guest today, and then we'll get into the conversation, and I'll also talk about Taj Mahal a bit, but I'll let the speaker, my guest, speak a lot more than me. So, Tilottama Shome is an architect by training and a wanderer by profession. Curious about all things historical and old, she has traveled, or rather wandered, in different countries, soaking in the local history, food, architecture, and has friends all over the world. Her interest in history and architecture and an inherent need to relate the stories of our buildings to the youth led her to write this series of books on Indian monuments called Magnificent Monuments of India series. She sometimes took her two daughters along as she researched the monuments. I think one is in America now studying, and they explored a lot of bat infested caves that she has written, and taking guided tours from a plethora of amusing storytellers. She has also done translations from Bengali that have been published by the same publication called Talking Cup, and Pratham books that you all can get on their website. And I think I must recommend the children's Ramayana to all of you that I have read, I think 2 years or 3 years ago, if I'm not wrong. So, welcome Tilottama. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's an honor hosting you on Caravan finally.
Thanks, Ishan. And I've been following you, and I'm a fan of yours. So we have a mutual admiration society. Hopefully, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. So, Rosa-e Munawwara, as Taj Mahal was known, still it's known among scholars and academia. We refer to Taj Mahal as Rosa-e Munawwara. So, tell us about how you got fascinated to the monument and why you thought that you should start the series with Taj Mahal.
So when we were talking about this series, me and the team in the publishers company, the idea was that to bring out a series of books on these magnificent monuments that India has, and nobody has really found time to write about these with children in mind. I mean, you have big coffee table books, and you have academic journals which have featured lots of articles about these things, research documents, all of that is there, but nothing which is there for children. And I think that was, we felt that was a big gap that had to be fulfilled by somebody.
Yeah.
And because it's important for us as for important as children to know about your heritage, firstly, and secondly, when you read about monuments and architecture and all these kind of things, you automatically get an orientation towards design and aesthetics, which I think as a society we really lack currently. In the ancient past, India was known for its design and craftsmanship and all of this. But I think today, if you just look at our homes, our built environment, our urban landscape, it's not so pretty. And a lot of it is because we don't have an orientation or an appreciation of nicely designed spaces. And so one that was one of the objectives of coming out with the series, is to build inquisitiveness over about design and beautiful things, and appreciating all of that, and understanding why certain things are built a certain way and how are they built, all of those things. So the idea was to tell the story of each monument, why it was built, who built it, and introducing basic, very very basic um, terminologies used by architects and designers, and so that it becomes part of our normal lingo. It's not something that is it's not like a technical term to be scared of, or you come to know of it when you go to college. It's something that, like you do maths and you know what multiplication and division means, or you know what pi means in school. It's as simple as that. So if you know what pi is, you should know what a plan is. So that was the idea. So and then Taj Mahal was the first book because it was a pretty obvious one. It has a brilliant history to talk about. It
Yeah.
is the most beautiful structure that we have within our country by far. And why not delve into it, and why not share all the details of its really multifaceted story? Because the story of the Taj Mahal is not just about the Taj Mahal. It's actually, the backstory goes back to Mughal history from the time that Babur entered the Indian subcontinent from Central Asia, and all of that contributed to where Taj Mahal is eventually today as the culmination of Mughal architecture. So there was a lot to talk about. So therefore Taj Mahal, and then we are doing a lot of other interesting. We want to make sure that we cover every geographical region of India, um, types of buildings, and so yeah, it's going to be interesting to work on this series.
Yeah. So introducing very important terms relating to heritage and history, I think is a very important step that we need to take to to make education more inclusive, in the sense that we don't just isolate humanities, and that's what is happening with the education system now,
I mean,
that we have.
my
And
daughter studies liberal arts
yeah,
in college, and one of the questions that I often get asked is, so what is she going to be doing after that? And my answer to that is, I don't know. Her education is not a return on investment.
yeah,
She will decide what she will decide based on her interests, and there is much. I mean, the world is run on humanities actually, uh, not so much by science but by humanities as values. So our education system is a pretty skewed one that way, and I think slowly and surely there should be people who make small changes to change the attitude actually.
yes. So the book, for those who are listening to us, the book is divided into many chapters, which range from a basic introduction to who the Mughals were, because nowadays the narrative that goes is that Mughals were foreigner, they were invaders, they kind of brought in the dark ages to Indian history, or the end of the Hindu India, as they say. But then also the story moves forward. Tilottama mentions about the emperor who lost his wife Shah Jahan and Mumtaz, and then she takes you through a journey, a voyage kind of a thing through the Taj Mahal, which is kind of a very interesting heritage walk in itself without going outside because it's too hot right now. So I prefer sitting in a good air conditioned room rather than going out now. Unfortunate as that might sound, but I think that's the thing now. Then she also deals with another interesting aspect of it, which is who built the Taj Mahal. And there's so much myth around it, especially relating to the name of the architects. There are various scholars who have said that Ifandi from Turkey was the architect, and then there are scholars who refuted that argument, saying no, Ifandi was not, because the first mention of Ifandi comes from a 19th century document, and this monument was about 16th century, so about 200 300 years gap, and after that, that only we have the evidence of Ifandi from Turkey being named as the architect. So we'll talk about that also in this. And then the last chapter of the book is the legacy of Taj Mahal, how we see Taj Mahal today, or we'll also talk about the myths of Taj Mahal. But before that, uh, I don't know if many people know that this is not the original place where Mumtaz was buried. She was buried in a place called Burhanpur. And then there is a whole story of her travel after her death to Agra. So, Tilotma, would you like to share that story with us?
Yeah, so Mumtaz Mahal actually, she was Shah Jahan's companion through his career, and most of his career was fighting on behalf of his father's kingdom when they were fighting in the Deccan or various other places. And wherever he would go, she would accompany him. The Zenana would accompany him, and they would travel, and they would set up tents, or they would go and occupy some palace somewhere and live there. And Mumtaz Mahal continued to give birth to her several children while being on the road and on the move. So Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal were obviously very close because they were travel companions and companions for life. And eventually, when they were in Burhanpur for one of these military reasons, and that's where, while giving birth to her 14th child, she died. So when she died, the by Mughal rites, she had to be buried right away, and so she was buried in Burhanpur, in the gardens behind the palace. And and Shah Jahan went into this deep state of grief when he stopped doing a lot of things, like that, or anything that would interest him earlier, he stopped doing that. And uh, and he would spend a lot of time at the grave and praying and all of these things. And at that point, he decided that he needed to build something grand in the memory of Mumtaz Mahal, who had been his companion for quite a few years. And so, when thinking about what to build and where to build, he was thinking of something grand. And so, only one city came to the emperor's mind, and that was the mighty city of Agra, where his ancestors had spent years building forts and gardens and palaces and tombs. And it was next to the river Yamuna. And somehow, Shah Jahan's imagination at that point was that his wife would be entombed in a beautiful building next to the river amidst lush gardens, and that would be like as though she was lying in paradise, as paradise has been described in the holy books that he had read. And Agra came to mind, and the river Yamuna flew through Agra, and that would be bringing fresh melted Himalayan snow. It sounded like paradise. And so, therefore, the plan was that this mausoleum would get built in Agra, which meant that she would have to be interred, she had to be exhumed, and they had to make this journey to Agra, which wasn't really it wasn't kosher according to Mughal rules of funerals and burials. But the the Mughals had a tendency to break rules when they wanted to. So so they decided to do this, and so she was taken out, and she was accompanied by her son Shashuja, and they made this journey, and they came to the location where eventually the Taj complex would be built. But she was first buried at another location, from not the location where, because they had to build the plinth before she could be brought to the final resting place. So she was buried in the forecourt area, and then later on she was moved to the final resting place when the plinth came up and the lower levels had been built. So that was the journey of Mumtaz. So Mumtaz Mahal, like she just was on the move all through her life, and then after her death as well, for quite some time before she found her final resting place in the mausoleum.
Yeah, and the whole building of Taj Mahal was a grand affair, as many of the travelers who visited India during the construction of Taj around 1640, 1635, they have written about how many people were at work. I think about 20,000 laborers were at work, and about 1,000 used to work every day uh, for making the Taj what it is today. So
Yeah, there are descriptions which say that all the material was coming from different parts of the country, from Rajasthan, from different parts of Western India, and these bullock and oxen carts and camel carts would be bringing these huge quantities of stone and various material, and there would be, and the entire complex had these ramps and complicated scaffolding which had been built for the structure to come up. And these ramps were built, and the animals would tow all the material using these ramps. The ramps were like miles long if you would measure them. They were like miles long to take them up to different levels, um, and the building was actually coming up behind the scaffolding.
yes,
So, so if one can imagine that the whole building came up, but nobody really saw it except the builders and the person who was envisioning it. And eventually, it was decided that the scaffolding has to be removed on a certain day. And legend says that it was announced to the citizens of Agra that they could come and take away the uh, bricks which had been used to make the scaffolding. Um, so people just came overnight and took away these bricks as building material that they could use later on. And suddenly, this whole place was empty of the scaffolding, and this beautiful building was suddenly, like, over the city of Agra. That would have been quite magical, I would imagine. So, it must have been a really, really interesting time to visit Agra. Those
yeah.
20 years.
Yeah, but also there is a question around the name of the architects of Taj Mahal, as we mentioned, that people say it was Lahori or Ifandi, but some sources say that the contemporary source, which is Lahori, who was the court historian of Shah Jahan, he says that the emperor was the chief architect and they were consultants. What's
Yeah.
your take?
Yeah, so for my research says the same thing, that Shah Jahan himself was basically the visionary, and he was very detail oriented. He would come up with ideas, and he would listen to, take inputs, and then give his feedback very regularly. He would have meetings with his chief craftsman, the master craftsman, and the overall vision was his. The details were worked out by various other senior craftsmen, and one of the names that comes up is of Ustad Ahmed Lahori, who was who was called Minar e Kul, which is the chief architect, and he was a person who worked on various projects of Shah Jahan, including Shah Jahanabad and Jama Masjid in Delhi. And in his at his grave in Aurangabad, it's mentioned that he was the architect of the Taj Mahal, and his son has documented that his father was the one of the main architects behind the Taj Mahal and Shah Jahan. So it's quite probable that he was one of the main people. He was a polymath kind of a person. He was a mathematician and a designer and all of that. Persian and Mughal architecture depended a lot on mathematics because it was very symmetry based, and it was a very structured thing. So he was a mathematician, and I think right now peace has been made with the fact that Shah Jahan was the chief architect of sorts, and he had this team of which Ustad Ahmed Lahori is one of the names that is taken as the main architect of the project.
Yes. And why don't you take us through a journey, how they planned Taj Mahal or the complex?
Sure, yeah, would love to do that. If you could share the slides.
Is it visible now?
Yeah. So, what you're seeing in front of you is basically an artist's rendition of the Taj Mahal as it would have been during the time of its construction, which is that it was surrounded with lush greenery, not the manicured gardens that we see today, because that was something that came up much later. Um, uh, when it was rebuilt by Lord Curzon and the reconstruction that happened around that time. So, like I mentioned, the Taj Mahal was a vision of Shah Jahan when he was in deep mourning, and he imagined his wife's grave in this beautiful building in a city like Agra, which was fed by the melted snow from the Himalayas to the river Yamuna. But before Shah Jahan built his wonder, his ancestors had already become known as artists and builders. So whether it was Babur or Akbar or Jahangir or Noor Jahan or Bega Begum, all of them had made their mark as prolific builders. Each one had his or her own style, and all of that contributed to what we know today as Mughal architecture. So Taj Mahal would be a symbol of Shah Jahan's love, but at the same time, it was bringing together some of the finest traditions of Mughal art and architecture. So I'll talk a little bit about the garden and the principles. So if you can move to the next slide. Um, so each of the Mughal rulers before Shah Jahan had encouraged a certain type of design which became kind of representative of that era of that king. So when the Taj was to be built, it became a culmination of several years of Mughal architecture. It was going to be a monument which was placed at the end of a formal garden and built in a scale that would be awe-inspiring, which all of us experience when we walk into the Taj Mahal complex. And it became the most perfect version of Mughal design and art. So one of the important aspects of the Taj Mahal is not just the building, but the garden in which it is placed. The garden holds several symbolic meanings in the Mughal tradition, and it starts from the first Mughal, which was Babur. The Mughals were descendants of from Central Asia, and they had a history of nomadic life. So they lived in the outdoors in tents, and this resulted in a deep love for nature and an interest in bringing the beauty of natural surroundings into their built environment. So one can say that the Mughals were actually naturalists who became very prolific and accomplished landscape architects. So Babur moved from Central Asia and he came to Agra, and he really disliked the heat and the dust of the place, and it was all very dry and there was no water and none of this was there. So he brought in this garden tradition, which was already a part of Persian architecture, and this was called the Char Bagh tradition. And this is what today we call it the Mughal gardens, but basically it is drawn from this Persian concept of the Charbagh. So if you can go to the next slide. So what happens in the Charbagh is that it's laid out in, if you see the picture on your left, it's a conceptual Charbagh. Basically, it's a square which is further divided into four parts by two axes, uh, vertical and horizontal. And this, the two axes are basically paved walkways with sunken water channels in them, which divides the big square into four equal sized squares. And the center of the garden, where the two lines meet, intersect, that is where there would be either a pavilion or a tomb or a pool. And so this was what Babur brought into a lot of his buildings and structures that he built in Agra. And this was known as the Chaharbagh or the Charbagh, which is a four-part garden. And the Mughals went on to build different kinds of variants of the Charbagh, and the Taj Mahal is only one variant, which is the waterfront garden. But before that, much before Taj Mahal, the Charbagh concept was built to perfection almost at the Humayun, at the tomb built for Humayun by his wife Bega Begum. The picture on your right is the plan of the Humayun's tomb in Delhi. Humayun's tomb is an early example of the Charbagh, and the building here is at the center of the garden. And it was the first major Mughal building which used a lot of concepts of Mughal architecture as we know them today. It used red sandstone and white marble, a combination of the two things. And the combination went on to become a feature of Mughal architecture. The tomb was a large double vaulted dome, was topped by a double vaulted dome, which is again a feature of Mughal architecture and was used in the Taj Mahal. If you go to the next slide, we'll get a picture to see of the Humayun's tomb. That's Humayun's tomb in the garden. You can see the waterway in the middle. And Humayun's, the tomb itself is sitting at the center of that axis. So Humayun's tomb broke, like we were talking about Mughal architecture breaking rules of Islam. So Humayun's tomb was one of those. It broke quite a few rules for that Islam had for burial spots. The idea of making burial spots monumental is not something that is encouraged because it defies the rule that graves should be simple structures. They're not meant to be grand, rich constructions where people come to pay their respects to the buried emperor. It was a contradiction of Islamic rule that burials should become a place of pilgrimage. The idea was that uh, burials should be simple and it should be open to sky. But Humayun's, the Bega Begum's design, which was what we see today, was a combination of this grand scale uh, combined with a lot of thought on Indo-Persian design, and it became a trendsetter of sorts in Mughal architecture because from then on a lot of these grand buildings started getting built. So going to the next slide. So the design of Mumtaz Mahal's final resting place was going on, and Shah Jahan and his team started incorporating all these elements that we are speaking of in a much more polished form. By then, several years have gone by, and from the time of Humayun's tomb to the time that the Taj Mahal was being built, a lot of design ideas had gotten polished. And the final design for Mumtaz Mahal's home in paradise was almost perfection. It was as if it had no human error. It was so beautifully constructed and so beautifully designed and perfectly calculated as far as mathematics was concerned. So the Charbagh was used as a concept, um, and the design of the Taj Mahal was going to use elements such as sandstone, marble, local materials, Hindu craftsmanship, Hindu art, And all of this combined made it a beautifully built thing. And what makes the Taj remarkable is that each element in its construction had deep thought and meaning. Um, Starting from the site itself, the choice of the site. So to build the Taj, Shah Jahan chose a site that belonged to the Raja Mansingh of Amber. And at that time, the area was in the ownership of the Raja's grandson Jai Singh. And Shah Jahan wanted to get that particular piece of land. And in exchange for the land, Shah Jahan gifted 4 mansions in Agra to Jai Singh. And there are records to say that Jai Singh wanted to give the land as gift to the king, but Shah Jahan insisted on a transaction so that in the future there would be no confusion regarding the land ownership. And we know where what is being discussed nowadays. But it was pretty clear at that time that Shah Jahan was very clear that he was buying this land in exchange for the mansions that he would be giving, and this was now his property. And like you're seeing in the picture, the location of this land was at the bend of the Yamuna River, which allowed the grave to be aligned perfectly towards Mecca. And from the main fort, the you got a beautiful framed vision of the Taj Mahal, which is what Shah Jahan actually saw for years when he was imprisoned in the Agra fort by Aurangzeb. And the Yamuna was flowing by, feeding the Himalayan waters into the picture and the symbolizing the fresh flowing waters of Jannat. Going to the next slide. This is a three-dimensional sketch of the complex on the garden side of the Taj Mahal complex. And the entire layout of the Taj Mahal complex is divided into 2 zones. So the northern part or the upper part of the complex is the funerary or the spiritual zone, and this has the mausoleum, a mosque, an assembly hall, and the Charbagh garden. And this is the sacred area meant for prayers, for paying respect, and the more somber part of the complex. The southern zone of the complex is the more worldly zone, and this includes the forecourt, which is called the Jilau Khana, the quarters for tomb attendants. Then there are the smaller tombs of the other queens of Shah Jahan, and that area is called the Saheli Burj. And then there are the bazaar streets to the extreme south. Going to the next slide. So if you look at the right hand side of this plan, in the original plan, which is the southern half of the complex, was a large bazaar complex with shops and caravanserais. And this area was also divided into 4 courts, kind of reflecting the Charbagh plan of the garden area. But now this part of the complex is completely lost, and the modern city of Agra has pretty much taken over that part. And but we can kind of imagine what it must have been like to be a visitor to the Taj in the Mughal times. Standing in that bazaar amidst all the bustle, one could stand and view the monument in all its glory and magnificence. So, going to the next slide. Today, we enter the Taj Mahal from the southern side, and it appears as though it was designed to be viewed from the main gate on the southern side. But it's interesting to note that the Emperor Shah Jahan actually never entered the mausoleum complex from here. The royal family actually approached the mausoleum from the river side. So the picture that you're seeing is a plan of overview of the city of Agra with the river in blue and white. The Taj Mahal complex you can see marked out on the southern side of the river. And the fort was on the left hand side of the picture. Um, so the royal family would approach the mausoleum from the river. They came in barges which they boarded at the Agra fort, which was their residence, and they alighted at the riverside steps of the Taj Mahal. At the foot of the terrace of the Taj Mahal next to the river were landing steps, and these led to stairs that took you up to the level of the mausoleum. So Shah Jahan and his family members, they would arrive by boat and use this route to visit his wife's grave. Today one can't see it much because the landing site is now covered by silt and sand. Um, but what is interesting to note is that below that marble platform where they would alight were a gallery of rooms, and this was called the Tehkhana. And there were several large rooms here connected to each other, and these rooms were actually used by these royal visitors to rest when they came to the tomb. The rooms used to open to the river through the arches, and later these arches were closed. And now, of course, these rooms from the platform have been closed quite a few years ago. And these are the rooms that were referred to in the recent PIL that was brought to the Supreme Court. So royal visitors climbed, so there is no truth to say that there were any idols or anything. These were actually resting rooms. Royal visitors would climb the staircases to the platform, pay their respects at the crypt, possibly rested at these rooms overlooking the river below the platform, and then they would depart by the boat. And it was the river that connected the fort to the illumined tomb, as it was called. And if you look at the picture that is there right now, it seems that the larger plan that Shah Jahan had envisioned was that the river of Jannat that was meant to flow past Mumtaz Mahal's grave was actually the Yamuna and not the channels of water that were in the Charbagh. Because on the other side, if you see the picture, um, there is another structure which is known as Mehtab Bagh. And Mehtab Bagh is like a symmetrical building structure which was built to kind of reflect the other side of the river. Um, it's said that Shah Jahan had planned a black Taj Mahal on that side, but there is nothing to support this theory. What Mehtab Bagh was a symbolic interpretation of Jannat, where there would be these gardens on the other side of the river. There were similar channels of water coming and converging in the center, and there was a reflective pool which would reflect the Taj Mahal on a perfectly moonlit night. And all of this has been discovered through studies and archaeological diggings. And what it makes this plan is that it makes it doubly grand. Shah Jahan's vision to be doubly grand. It is not restricted to the southern side of the complex that we see today, but it includes almost double the size of that as part of the overall plan. And the reflection of the Taj Mahal in the waters of that octagonal pool was almost like it was like a locus of intersection between the earthly world of the Taj Mahal and the cosmic presence of the Taj Mahal. So it was like a passage of uh, passage of Mumtaz Mahal's spirit from this world to Jannat, pretty much. If you go to the next picture, you'll see the view of um, the Taj Mahal from Mehtab Bagh. So the white mausoleum of the Taj Mahal could be seen, and it would be reflected in the octagonal pool on the Mehtab Bagh side. And the cardinal directions in this layout was perfect. The Yamuna was flowing from east to west, and the other two, the canals of the two baghs were flowing north to south, and the mausoleum was at the center. So like I said, it was double the size of what we had assumed the original plan was based on what we see today. If you go to the next slide, that's a view of the Taj Mahal from the riverside, and you can see uh, the mosque on one side and the assembly hall on the other side. It was a grand plan. Something of this scale could be only expected from a builder like Shah Jahan. His vision was extraordinary, and his intent was to create masterpieces of architecture that were symbolic of his stature of being a great man. Just quickly going through some of the other details of the building. The mausoleum was designed on a plan known as the Hasht Bihisht plan, which was used by the Mughals quite frequently. So, if you look at the octagonal drawing on your left bottom side of the slide, this is the plan of the Taj Mahal. The octagon is divided into four again by two imaginary axis lines intersecting at the center, and that's where the central octagonal hall is. And this has the domed ceiling, and surrounding it are a crisscross of corridors and smaller rooms, which are all interconnected. So a visitor can walk along these passages and take a full circle of the interiors of the main floor of the Taj Mahal, peeping into every room as they walk. And if you look at the section of the building that is drawn above that, you can see the central hall with the dome on top. You can see the Tehkhana marked out below, and the other levels within the Taj Mahal structure. Going to the next slide. So, like I'd said earlier, the Taj is actually replete with symbols, from its plans to every element of its construction and design, and even in the materials that were used. The main structure has red sandstone and a lot of white marble. The Mughals used both these materials in varying degrees over the years, and the red sandstone was preferred as red was considered an imperial color by the Mughals. And white, on the other hand, denoted purity and spirituality. And in the Taj, we have both these, and it's pretty clear that it was very intentionally used to depict the design of the building. The main mausoleum is entirely clad in marble, signifying that it is the most important building in the complex and the spiritual center. And the surrounding structures have a combination of the two main building materials. Going to the final slide. So that's a view of the Taj Mahal through the gardens as it is today. Mumtaz Mahal's resting place was meant to be her house in paradise, and in the Quran, paradise is said to be filled with flowers and water bodies and gardens, and we see all of that in the Taj Mahal. Over the centuries that the Taj Mahal has existed, the gardens have changed form from its original lush, very organic kind of fruit laden, flower laden trees and scrubs and shrubs and bushes to a more formal British layout of the English garden. Um, Nevertheless, the gardens remain. Um, and besides the actual trees and flowering plants that are there, there are floral decorations on the building itself. There are flowers carved by hands of unknown craftsmen into the marble and the sandstones, which are permanently etched. And the peripheral buildings and even all the other buildings around have got a lot of floral carvings and inlay work, all of which is supposed to signify paradise. But in the Taj, one has come to know that there is not just one layer of meaning. So there are several layers of meanings, and the flowers and the flowering plants also signify Shah Jahan's rule as a great emperor. These were apparently part of his political propaganda, and his biographers wrote, probably directed by him, that his rule symbolized a period of prosperity and beauty, which were represented through these floral motifs. So, similarly, there are several references to the imperial family comparing them with flowers. So, that is how we see that there are several layers of meaning in everything that was done in designing the final complex of the Taj Mahal. Every element had thought behind it. And the Taj Mahal, therefore, with every inch of its structure, proclaims many things. It proclaims the love of a man for his wife, an earthly reflection of paradise, a serene and spectacular resting place of a queen, and finally, the grandeur and ambition of a great Mughal king. So, that is the story of how the Taj Mahal was conceptualized.
Thank you so much, Tilottama, for that. And it's nice that you mentioned about the political grandeur of the emperor, because I was about to ask you that Taj Mahal couldn't just be the symbol of love of a husband for a wife, where it would be a very expensive affair to do that once the wife dies or once the husband dies. So that's of no use. But I think the construction of such architecture was also very politically thought of,
Yes.
because nobody is buried above the floor, above the ground. It's always under the ground, and people don't understand that the platform is just for decoration or something like that, just to show the grandeur of the person buried inside the tomb. Because I've seen people going to say Humayun's tomb, thinking that it is the original tomb of Humayun where he was buried, but it's always under the ground. So great that you mentioned that symbolism also in the end, but also that brings us to the fact that we always talk about Taj Mahal as one single building, but we hardly talk about Taj Mahal as part of a bigger plan, which included the Mehman Khana, which included the Jama Masjid, which included the Jilwa Khana, and also the Mehtab Bagh now, and the rest of Taj Ganj, which was around Taj Mahal. So
Actually, every structure in the Taj Mahal, except in the complex, except the main monument, has a reflecting structure. So, the mosque has the assembly hall, the Charbagh is symmetrical, the Naubat Khana has another Naubat Khana, the forecourt has got structures which are reflecting each other. The Charbagh is reflected by the layout of the bazaar area, which of course is lost now, but it was there originally. And this entire complex is reflected on the other side of the river through the Mehtab Park. So everything another version of, like a reflection of it in some ways. So it was like a grand plan. It was not just the Taj Mahal, but the by making that structure in white marble and making it so pure, and uh, it was very obviously the center point, but everything else around it was equally thought of for whatever it had meaning at different layers. And yes, it was part of Shah Jahan's grand plan to keep his flag flying high into posterity. Everybody in centuries, for centuries to come, would know that Shah Jahan built this. And that was part of his plan. That was part of his plan to build, to create his name and let it remain in our history books forever.
I think that was the empirical vision of Shah Jahan, that he thought of having visitors visiting this tomb after many centuries, and that I think happened, and that was the great vision of Shah Jahan in that sense, that he managed to uh, make a wonder of the world that we have today. But
What
also,
I find very poignant is that he did all of this, and in the last years of his life, he spent imprisoned in the Agra fort, where he could see the Taj Mahal from his terrace, and he spent hours just sitting there looking at the Taj Mahal, just like any normal human being. And he was imprisoned, he was helpless. His only companion was his elder daughter, and he was just there, and he was looking at his life's work. All the vision had been implemented, but at that point he was as much just a viewer of his own work as anybody else. So,
uh, a silent audience too. He had no power. And the painting, I think there is also a famous painting, but there is this bluish print of the same painting by Kavita in your book. And
the painting was actually originally by Abanindranath Tagore.
yeah, and you also mentioned his brother's poetry towards the end of the book, Rabindranath Thakur's poetry
Yeah.
on Taj Mahal. But now coming back to the structure of the book, you have mentioned so many archaeological or historical terms, or terms relating to architecture, especially Persian. terms Hushpahis being one. I got to know that term when I was in my second year of graduation in Delhi University, when we had to read Abacok's work, the complete Taj Mahal, just to clear our examination.
Hmm.
As a writer and also as an architect yourself, how difficult is it to introduce such terms to young audience?
I think every term can be simplified to its basic level, and we have tried to do it in this book. I mean, if you go right to the end of the book, there is an author's note which explains what plan, section, and elevation means as terms. And we've given very simplified explanations on all the three terms with reference drawings of um, a plan, section, and elevation of a building, along with a corresponding explanation of what it would look like if you cut an apple into half, and a plan of an apple and a section and a thing. So, if one wants, it can be simplified. It does not have to be so complex, and I think it's only to the benefit of the reader to understand a little bit of these things, because it just helps us visualize better if you know what a plan is. I came to know what a plan was when I went to first year of architecture school, and it just blew my mind to think, oh my god, this is what bird's eye view means. It's looking at the building from the top without any perspective attached to it. It's like just slicing it from the top and looking down at it. It's a very simple idea, and I think it's very easy to be able to explain these if you want to do it. We've tried to do it a little bit over here. Some terms like the double vaulted dome, what is a chhatri, um, different kinds of arches, and just simple terms. We've tried to explain a little bit of all these terms, and I think it's interesting for some children. Definitely, they'll be interested to know these kind of terms. So,
And you mentioned about the Tagkhana during that presentation, and I was reading, I think Rana Safvi has mentioned it on her Twitter or something, that the Tagkhana was actually open for public till 1978 or 79.
right.
And Ava Koch has also mentioned and has a picture of Tagkhana in her book. For those who want to read it, it is available online as PDF, or if you can get 2,000 rupees out of your pocket, get a
It's
hard copy.
actually a beautiful book. It's worth just having it if you're interested in any kind of history of this country.
Yes. So, for people who are very interested in looking into the Tagkhanas, can read that book and understand the
Yeah.
what's
And then there
inspired.
is no confusion after that that this Taikhana was anything other than what it was meant to be.
Yes. And then there is this myth of Black Taj that you mentioned. There's another myth which people think as history, and that was taught to school students for a very long time, that Shah Jahan got his laborers' hands chopped off, or he paid them so handsomely that they could not make another wonder of the world. So, how do you see that kind of myth being thrown around?
I have not come across any documentary proof of any of this. And the books that I have used as reference for research, which is whether it's Eba Kok or Begley or Amita Beg's multiple narratives, various books, all of them have actually said that this is just a myth and there is no reality to any of these stories. So it makes for good reading. I mean, it could make a nice movie or something like that to make, or just to make people agitated if you don't have anything better to do at that point. So for all that, this is good fodder, but it's all none of it is supported by any kind of facts.
Yes. And I think that is why people must read this book. I'll just put it up again so that people can see Taj Mahal, the story of a wonder of the world, because it's not just for kids. It's, I think now, after seeing recent news around many monuments, I think grown-ups, people older than me who are in their 50s, 60s, should also read this book and the whole monument series, because I just got the advanced copy of the next book. in the series, which is about the Kailasha temple at Ellora.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, and I was reading about it, and I'm really excited to read the complete book. But then again, the question is because you mentioned it in the last chapter of the next book, if I can mention that, it's about how to conserve heritage. The question always arises about Taj also, because Taj is in a in this it's an industrial city now, Agra, and it's there's a lot of air pollution, water pollution because of the all the industries there, and also the oil refinery which is just next to Agra. So how do you see the city space of Agra now, and do you think ASI is doing enough to conserve a monument like Agra?
ASI is doing a lot, obviously, to conserve the complex of the Taj Mahal. But I don't know how much anything is being done to integrate the city of Agra into this whole plan. And I think that is what is more important to be doing right now, because the people of Agra are completely isolated from the Taj project. So unless you are actively engaged in some kind of an economic activity that is connected to the Taj Mahal, it is pretty much a monument, and a monument which is isolated from the city. It's like I mentioned in my book, the monument is like a diva, like a movie star who is wearing all the fineries and sitting over there, but cannot mingle with the people because people are not able to approach him or her. So it's very important that something is done to integrate the city with the monument and bring in the stories that would be lying in these homes of the old city of Agra, where possibly families go back to the times when their ancestors helped build the Taj Mahal, probably would help quell and squash these theories of arms being cut off and people being killed and things like that. Because these are the families who are probably the descendants of the original craftsmen who built the Taj. So it would be really interesting to actually draw these people into the story. When somebody goes to visit today, when you visit the city to see the Taj Mahal, you don't try and avoid the city of Agra because it's congested, it's dirty, there's nothing to do besides seeing the Taj Mahal. There is nothing of interest besides some of these Mughal buildings which are there. It all needs to be tied together to make it into one comprehensive, large, beautiful city. And I wish somebody would think of it as a more holistic exercise than a wholesome exercise where everything is integrated.
And I think organizations like Intech and others, and other private players can do a lot towards this. But
Absolutely.
I think it's also the government's interest towards heritage that might play a big role, but they are not very interested now. But let's wait for the right time for these sites to get
So
it.
that
And
is again another purpose for this series, to create the next generation to create interest in the next generation towards conservation and heritage, something which is really deep rooted, not just like external repairing of plaster and paint, but actually looking deeper into the question of conservation of heritage in a manner which is makes it part of our current society.
and not like what they did with the Jallianwala Bagh for that matter. But I'll also want to talk about the legacy of Taj Mahal. What happened to Taj Mahal after Shah Jahan, or after the Mughals, after Shah Jahan, or Aurangzeb and others, when the Britishers came, and it was, I think you mentioned, Major William Palmer who was stationed at Agra. So would you like to tell us about that, the British time and
Yeah, it became part of an extended part of the British Army's sort of cantonment area, and it actually became like an entertainment zone for them. So the people would come and picnic over there. There would be music playing, and there are lots of stories of British Army personnel spending a lot of time in the gardens over there, parties being held. There's a story of this lady who fell off that plinth which is there, and she died because of it was an accident. And the so there was this whole part of history when this was before the mutiny, actually, before the mutiny, and when this whole complex was being used by the British Army for as an entertainment area. And then post mutiny, when Lord Curzon came, Lord Curzon was a conservationist, and he did a lot of good work in terms of actually conserving. And he was quite significant in setting up a lot of the rules and regulations around old structures. So he moved the army out of this area, and he was actually instrumental in relaying the garden, a lot of conservation and repair work that was happening at the time. He spent a lot of money on the Taj Mahal, and this eventually later on went on to uh, the ASI being set up as a body, and thereafter it's been under the ASI. So,
And after independence, I think the public in India started interacting with the monument as a public space more than ever. But also there are myths among the public, especially since PNO started wrote a book called Taj Mahal as Teju Mahalaya, and then the whole movement began. But I think that's part of when a monument becomes a public space. It kind of
create
uh,
their own stories. People feel they have the right to create their own stories around it, and and all the stories of PNOs are like stories because they are completely beyond my understanding as anything logical. Because and thankfully now today we know that there is agreement by the court and everybody else that these are just fables. We can keep interpreting and reinterpreting things to suit our own viewpoint, but that doesn't make it right or true. So,
I hope the petitioners get themselves enrolled in MES. I will be doing this year, so it would be good to have such classmates. But at the end of this conversation, I would highly recommend everybody to get this book on Amazon or through any bookstores that you know might be having this book. Please read such books because in India we really do need good children literature, good literature for people of all ages actually, and such books might make heritage sites more humane to you by introducing such very difficult terms very in lighter note, maybe through stories and through anecdotes, through also such wonderful painting by Kavita Singh Kale. I would also like to point this out because she in the show once again the such painting she did for the book. I think for the next book also and for the entire series you'll see more of her work. So it's 50-50 for both the author and the
should
illustrator.
have Kavita on board sometime because these kind of books are incomplete without the illustrations and
Yeah.
pictures. And I wouldn't have dared to write it based on only the text. And I worked quite hard along with Kavita and the designers to make sure that there are enough illustrations to make it more visually easy for children because that is the main audience. And now for anybody, whoever wants to read it, at least there is a visual reference for everything.
Yeah, yeah. And yes, I think we also are going to do a giveaway session, a giveaway for this book of Taj Mahal that will be out tomorrow on our Instagram account. So if you are not following us there, do follow us. I think we have three copies to give away to the winners. So make sure that you get one and you read it, and also you gift it to your younger sibling or your kids or your friends or even your school because schools do need it more than anything. And thank you so much, Tilottama, for for agreeing to do this. It was truly, I think I have many more questions to ask around Taj Mahal, but I think we had limited time today. But let's do another conversation. Here are the two books for those who wish to see. One is Kailasha Temple at Ellora and Taj Mahal. And there are, I think, four or five more to come in this series. So keep an eye on it. And I hope that it will cover different parts of India, be it Kashmir and Ladakh, as we talked yesterday, and various parts of India, because India is a treasure trove of architecture. And
And so many stories behind each one.
yes, yes. So that need to be told, and thank you so much for doing this, for taking undertaking this this project of publishing such books. Congratulations to the editor of the book, and to the to all the people at Talking Cup, and Tanu, who was a common thread between us. Though we were friends on Facebook, but still we got in touch because of Tanu and this book. So thank you so much, Tanu and her team. Thank you so much, Speaking Tiger. I hope you will give us more books to read. So, looking forward to more. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. We'll be back again with another session on Caravan. If you are new to this channel, you can consider subscribing. It doesn't cost anything. I always say it's free, but you get to learn a lot which you won't in your university. So, yeah, do that, and do share this video with